in Texas. What month was that? All right. Here we are for another interview today. I am with Mr. James Watters. Hey, James, how are you?
How's it going?
Senior Vice President of Strategy at Pivotal, and Joe Beda,
Hello.
Principal Engineer at VMware. Welcome. Great conference so far, SpringOne Platform. I sat in the keynote yesterday, and I wanted to go through it a little bit.
Okay.
And, Joe, I think there's some aspects of the keynote that you can speak to.
I'll do my best.
Okay. So, one of the things I heard you say right at the top of the top
Yeah.
was really about, you're trying to kind of pull it all together. You're talking about this litmus test, right?
Yeah.
And this understanding about how we think about software and how we think about that experience.
Yeah.
And we've heard a lot about this throughout the conference, like empowerment and empathy.
Yeah.
Maybe you could sum that up, what you were talking about, what you were trying to convey there.
Yeah, I think my opening thought was I was on my way down thinking about why do I get so excited about this conference every year? And it's because it's the one place where people who are really passionate about building modern applications in enterprises all hang out. And there's some places where that's considered oh, that won't happen, or we're not doing that yet, or we're straddled with so much heritage. But this is the conference where on stage you can see Netflix up there today saying, hey, we're all in on Spring Boot. It's how we build all of our applications. And then the next customer gets up from Home Depot or TDA, my friend VJ there, and said, we do it in the same way.
Yeah.
And to me, that's kind of inspiring because it's I think a lifeblood for enterprises to come to a place where they have a peer group that's doing the same difficult thing, which is really modernizing their applications.
Right.
So that's the context. And then the launching off there is that the heritage applications they have sometimes, they have these proprietary approaches to avoid coding.
Right.
So they might have a proprietary ESB that has some WYSIWYG connector in it. But when they try to test that in a CI/CD pipeline as part of their app, or they try to deploy that integration software, or they try to configure the API gateway as part of the CI/CD, it just makes their developers' lives hard.
Yeah.
And so I codified basically what was hundreds and hundreds of client meetings where what's going well in the project, okay, this thing, well, what's slowing you down, into that litmus test.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, so it's a litmus test is thinking about the context of what's going well, what is in the core of of the customer experience really, and what's not going well. I'm curious on, from both of your perspectives, what happens when it doesn't go well? What happens to that developer experience? What happens to that what happens inside the organization when you start having those sorts of issues?
Well, I think have you seen that that cartoon that's has the developers I don't know, playing ping pong? And
Yeah.
It's what are you doing? Oh, compiling. Well, you replace compiling with waiting for the push, waiting for this, waiting for that.
Uh-huh.
It just slows everybody down, and people go off and play ping pong. It's either that, or what they do is they route around the problem. They only test and develop with a subset. And one of the things that I think has been my experience is that every difference between development, staging, and production will eventually result in bugs and an outage, right? So as much as you can make your entire development, staging, production, as much as you can make that be exactly the same, the more reliably you'll be able to build and ship software. And so, yeah, you either, fall back on that and produce less reliable software and further slow yourself down, or you just, get frozen with indecision, really.
Yeah. And I think, just as I think about it, there's different layers of normalization that are happening, and Kubernetes has obviously been this incredible win of normalizing the infrastructure APIs. I won't describe it too much sitting next to Joe.
Right.
But it is a metaphor for me of what we're trying to do with Spring Boot and middleware too, which is we're trying to normalize any app integration configuration, any connection that you're building in the enterprise between data 1, data 2, data 3, and a programming activity you're taking on, applying Java code to it. We're trying to normalize that. And today, there's how do I configure one product? How do I configure product 2, product 3, product 4? And what we're seeing is that people are using Spring Boot now to build all of that. That was, in a sense, the heart of my keynote. And you can think of it as this is just another standardization layer that enables developer productivity. Does that make any sense,
Yes,
Alex?
it does, yeah. And I was going to ask then about some of the main themes then that you presented according to that litmus test, according to the, to the state really of Spring. And, and you talked a lot about continuous delivery, for example.
Yeah. Well, this is just, again, it's just experience. It's not anything other than watching the outcomes that customers are having. There's a new use case, there's a technology called Kafka, and people are building streaming apps. And one of our clients, one of the biggest retailers, had used a proprietary streaming approach stream processor before called Storm. Remember when Storm was out? Mm-hmm. And it had to have its own lifecycle management, everything else, and then they moved to Spring Streams in a normal Java application with Kafka, and they said, wow, this actually just fits our normal CI/CD model, and we were able to iterate through this project, and we got results, whereas we had failed for years before of achieving this before. So there are these emerging trends like streaming where just using a plain Java app, as simple as that sounds, is the new behavior. So that's what I'm excited about, because I don't really like these, what you might call sales-driven architectures, where people come in and like, oh, I'm selling you integration software. Use as much of it as possible. Like between every service that you have, you better jam my little ESB with my proprietary model. Right. So that's my passion, and companies are going along with that.
So you see a lot of, you both talk to lots and lots of customers, right? And you're talking with them a lot about kind of where they are, how they're, you're hearing their stories about their own development practices, and you're talking to then often, I expect developers and senior engineers. I'm curious on the contrast and what you hear from them and how it might have been reflected in the keynote. So for instance, for you, Joe, when you're out there talking to customers and engineers, we hear from like Home Depot and such. And they're not these isolated cases anymore, are they? We're starting to hear more stories, as we saw on the stage here. What is your insight into the opportunity there? For those developers out there who have been kind of working in these legacy kinds of environments, who now are getting that chance, maybe not to play as much ping pong, but they're getting the chance to actually kind of be able to build things that they couldn't build before.
Well, I think a couple of things that I think are interesting here. I mean, the first thing is, when we break down sort of what is kind of the definition of cloud, and this is a very abstract thing. In my mind, it's API-driven, self-service, and elastic, right? And as you have those qualities, it really enables you to do things like blue-green deployments where you spin up a whole nother copy of your infrastructure and swap things over, or run a test pipeline that looks just like production. I think that's a lot of what James is getting at. As we move these things from singleton sort of global variables with these sort of specialized systems where you have to file tickets to get things modified into things that are API driven and self-service, it changes the way that you build and ship and applications dramatically. And I think that we're seeing that apply both across multiple different levels of the way that people build software. And I think a lot of folks with Spring Boot, paired with something like Cloud Foundry, super powerful combination for a class of applications, and it really brings that sort of self-service, API-driven thinking to it. I think, and then as we drop down to a lower level with Kubernetes, the thing that surprises me is that people are applying this to all sorts of other domains that really surprise me. I think we see people using Kubernetes to deploy applications in retail stores across tens of thousands of retail stores, all the way up to the particle physics at CERN analysis being done with Kubernetes, right? And so the exciting thing I think looking forward is that we're actually looking to sort of not make these be two different sort of stops on us, but actually make it be a much more fluid spectrum so that folks can actually pick the right piece of the puzzle for their application, for the part of the application they need to solve, because applications. Well,
and the example I give is by definition. The other thing that happened is Pat Gelsinger came on stage and we talked about this model of compute called Tanzu that VMware's launched.
Yeah, and I can go into some detail there if you like.
And the endorsement that I gave it was, imagine the example I just gave you, got a Spring Boot plus Kafka app. Well, you need one abstraction to deploy and update your Spring Boot API. And Kafka has been one of the most, I think, a forward leaning of the data services in terms of leaning into Kubernetes as their native API layer or compute layer. And so you don't want to have two different islands of abstraction to use both.
Well, that's a good opportunity to talk about Tanzu.
Yeah, so I think, Tanzu is our, let me make sure I get the phrasing right. It's our portfolio of products and services that we break down across build, run, and manage, where build is adapting applications to run in a cloud-native environment, both the sort of code to production thing that really, Pivotal has done so much around, but also adapting open source and legacy applications through things like Bitnami and also the sort of core workflow that we see with the vSphere customer of like, hey, I have an app, I need to run it. So like, how do we develop and operate applications? Run is about delivering a consistent Kubernetes experience across all sorts of different environments built on a common technology base. And then manage is essentially managing this stuff at scale. When I say scale, I don't mean number of nodes, I mean the complexity of the environment, the number of clusters, the number of geographies, the number of teams. That ends up being the scale that a lot of enterprises struggle with when they start applying this technology across a large, complex company IT environment.
And Kubernetes is a platform for platforms in many ways, isn't it?
Yeah.
You've described it as that substrate, right?
Yeah, this is what's so exciting is that Kubernetes is both a way to schedule containers, but it also is in some ways a universal control plane for essentially hosting other automation. So when we talk about something like running Kafka on top of Kubernetes, it uses this idea, this thing that the term that's been coined as an operator, as in a piece of software, that essentially takes all these sort of manual runbooks that a lot of these systems have, renders those into code, and makes them self-managing. And Kubernetes provides the right feedback loops, the right structure to be able to do that.
Yeah, and to me it's so fun to watch just as an observer of it, because literally Confluent is running Kubernetes in the cloud for their Kafka service, and then they're using that operator and shipping that know-how to you in code on any infrastructure in the world. Like, we've never had that.
Yeah.
Like, that model's never existed, so it's pretty exciting.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'd like to get back to that in a minute, but I want to make sure that we cover some more bases, such as, you did announce Pivotal Application Service 2.7.
Yeah.
And I would like to kind of get your perspective on that, considering the themes that you're presenting in the keynote.
Yeah, I mean, one of the themes of the keynote is I gave a little credit to VMware, where we'd actually started Cloud Foundry years ago as being the company that has been pushing the developer experience in containers since 2010, when they invested in the first project. And the CF push experience continues to evolve in 2.7. We added some features to allow you to do blue-green deployments in an easier way, because that's, again, about that developer experience getting iterative change to production. And that continues to roll forward. So as we introduce Kubernetes as the container layer to that, getting that developer experience right, remains what I said kind of sacred. It was one of the first projects that really said, let's start this from a developer's perspective. Like, a developer has an app. He or she doesn't want to know about the infrastructure too much. They don't want to understand layer 7 networking too much, or layer 4. So why don't we just infer everything for them from the metadata of that app? Mm-hmm. And that's a model that I've seen companies that are struggling with microservices complexity is real. Like, actually making all these microservices work together is hard enough. Mm-hmm. So my advice is spend as much time on that as you can, and let your software supply chain, this automation, take care of getting your app to prod for you. So we continue to move forward on the PCF model. We call it Pivotal Platform now. Mm-hmm.
Which it seems like almost like an evolution in some respects of the roots of what you discussed in some of the pictures you show, for example, of that group of 6, right?
Yeah.
Back from those early
And that was
days.
so long ago that people pointed out that we were all wearing baggy jeans, which made me feel really old because it was true. It's so long ago, it's like hair from the 70s.
Yeah. And but now here we are, and this the kind of the term platform as a service has made some of a bit of a resurgence. But I love this idea of platform as platforms, because it gets into kind of the core, I think, for Kubernetes, and that really, I think, is starting to be really more discussed with custom resource definitions. And perhaps you could explain custom resource definitions and their applicability, because it was brought up today in the keynote as well, in terms of the changing nature of functions, for example.
Right, so I think, so Kubernetes is, it's a complex system, and I think some of that is necessary complexity. Just like James was saying that the goal with so much of Pivotal's efforts is to sort of make things work by magic. Being a piece of infrastructure, Kubernetes errs on the side of explicitness. And so, which is a good quality when you're trying to understand what's happening, can create some roadblocks for folks when they're learning it for the first time. And so there's a lot of sort of small objects that you have to program with Kubernetes, starting with things like the pod, which is sort of a set of containers on a machine. And then there's a replica set, which is an object that sort of manages making sure that you have a number of pods continuing to run. And then a deployment, which manages versions of those things over time. And these things are layered on top of each other. As we were developing Kubernetes, we realized that, hey, we're going to keep adding these things, and having them layer on top of each other and interact is a great thing. But we at some point, like, continuing to add these things to the core is not going to scale. And so at the time, Brendan Burns, another co-founder of Kubernetes, now at Microsoft, introduced this experiment called third-party resources. It got renamed into custom resource definitions, but it's essentially a way to define new objects, new behaviors in Kubernetes that aren't built in, but essentially are peers to those built-in objects. And so you can use these to essentially create your own abstractions that make sense to you. And so the analogy that I like to use is that, it's kind of like Lego bricks, where you can take these individual Lego bricks that come with Kubernetes and you can create something new out of it, but then it's actually a fractal thing, because then you can actually take those things and use those to actually construct things on top of that, right?
Right.
And so, I'm actually giving a talk tomorrow morning where I talk about Voltron, right? And there's this Lego set for Voltron.
I've seen the slides, they're good.
Right, and so Voltron is this, it's an 80s cartoon where there's these like robot lions that come together to build a big robot, right? But then there's a Lego set where those robot lions themselves are made out of Lego, right? So like you have building blocks building subunits that actually build the big thing. And so it's that sort of like hierarchical fractal nature that I think really starts to show the excitement and the power of the platform over time.
This brings up a question I want to ask.
Is it about Lego?
It relates to Legos.
Okay.
It relates actually to the, I'm not sure if it was you or Craig described it to me at VMworld as these are powerful tools and they also could be very sharp, right? and because you could build, a Voltron, right, out of Legos, but what if what if like the underlayer isn't really constructed properly, right? What if you're not using the right, architectural design? And what if you're like introducing things into this custom resource definition that can make it overly complex, for example? What is your definition of that, I think of CRDs as that sharp tool? How would you describe them as
I think, for me it's kind of like, I don't know, I'm dating myself again here, this isn't baggy jeans, but like when I was, I believe it was in high school, I had a friend who got like a new Mac, right, and it had like 13 fonts on it. And he sent me a letter with every single font used, right? Because it was like so exciting, right? And I think that, there's capability and then there's taste. And I think any time where we have new capabilities on a platform, whether it be fonts on desktop publishing or whether it be a tool like CRDs, figuring out the best practices is something that's going to take time.
That just takes time. And I think,
I think one example is that, I do know that like the OpenShift folks ran ahead and essentially created their own version of Kubernetes with OpenShift 3 where they added a bunch of objects to it. As they did so, they found out that they were actually pushing the system too hard in some cases. And so there's been sort of some, super early adopters of sort of extending Kubernetes. They did it in a kind of brittle way at the time. But there's been some hard lessons learned along the way as folks have used these tools in inappropriate ways. At the end of the day, Kubernetes is fundamentally a database, but it's not an application database. It's a configuration database for your program. And I think if anybody starts using it as an application database, they're gonna get themselves in trouble.
So coming back then to the keynotes then, and you have a Spring community here, and the Spring community continues to grow. I can't cite the exact numbers.
Can I cite one?
Yeah,
lots.
It was honestly, I sent the team, this is like how these things happen, you don't always keep track of it over a year. I sent Friday night, I was like, hey, I'm prepping all the data, I need all of because I wanted the finer talking points. Start.spring.io is where people start Java projects. And what's amazing about it is also where you pick your dependencies, like, oh, I want to use reactive, or I want to talk to this database, or I want to do streaming. So you can actually see what developers are really building too. It's pretty cool. And I call it sort of like the Grand Central or the central station of open source integration today, where all that comes together. I said, how many people are using this? They said, oh, there's 15 million projects a year right now. And that's projects kicking off. This is not like some CI server grabbing a Maven build or something. This is literally like people creating a new project. And it's every 2 seconds, a new project is created. So that to me is what's exciting about starting to give developers one way of bringing programming to all of this open source technology around it. And I think that's what Spring has done a great job of being the center of that new open cloud native community in terms of how enterprises use those technologies.
So maybe in conclusion to our discussion here, is like you started off with talking about how our perceptions on integration are changing, right?
Yeah.
I think you showed a slide where it's no longer a project, it's a product, for example.
Yeah, for sure.
Right. And so then there's other examples that you've cited here. For instance, in 2.7, we talked about Tanzu. It seems like open source continues to be a main theme. It's kind of your discussion with Pat. So I'm curious on like, where do you take things now? Where are we going? I heard a lot about React. I heard a lot about ways to like kind of almost create this semi-opinionated environment, right? So people don't get too lost, like you're saying, in these and cut themselves with sharp tools, right, so to speak. So curious on where your thoughts are going forward from here.
My simple, real quick, is I think there's a cloud native open source enterprise thing happening. And what I'm so excited about the potential with the collaboration and deeper work with VMware is it's sort of the biggest bet in cloud native open source enterprise right now. Yeah. Between the Kubernetes community and the Spring community and the CF push community, like it's the biggest bet on that. And I think it's going to continue to grow, and I think it's going to continue to grow at the expense of more proprietary approaches like packaged integration and these other packaged data pipeline products that are out there. That's my bet.
Yeah.
And the other bet is that developers are going to become more important to enterprises, that actually having great developers is going to be a differentiator. Yeah. So to me, you take those two things, those are our bets, like make developers happy and bet on open source cloud native.
So I think, 2 points. I think as we take the sort of the sensibilities and the experience and the passion that Pivotal brings with that sort of developer-focused workflow, and we take the sort of building block, super flexible approach that we have with Kubernetes, as we bring those things together, I think it's really it's a multiplicative thing, not an additive thing, right? I think we're going to see huge opportunities there. And then the second thing is that as we build an ecosystem that goes beyond just VMware and Pivotal and really just beyond the current sort of cloud native ecosystem that we see now, as this hits more mainstream, as we see more folks like Confluent with the Kafka operators, we see that stuff happening, what we're going to see is that the community as a whole is going to be larger than any one cloud. And so I think there's an opportunity for us to say that this community grounded in open source really creates this experience that is bigger than any one company can deliver.
Well, thanks to both of you for coming in and having this conversation about the keynote at SpringOne and some technical perspectives on what we've been hearing about here at the show. So thanks for your time.
Yeah, great to be here.
Thank you. Thanks for having us on.